Joining us now to discuss is Lieutenant Colonel Darin Gaub, geopolitical strategist and former Black Hawk helicopter pilot and battalion commander of the U.S. Army. Okay, Colonel, thank you very much for joining us today. So I want to start with President Trump's call with Russian President Putin earlier today. I don't know if you want to call this a renewed effort towards peace, but after the Alaska summit in August, things sort of cooled down a little bit. How are you reading the news now of their upcoming summit in Budapest?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Tom. I think a couple things. One of them is that this is a continuation. It's usually a process. It's rarely ever a one-shot wonder, I guess you could say, when it comes to trying to solve something this complicated. It's not surprising. We all wish something had happened a lot faster after the Alaska summit, but it clearly didn't. And Trump doesn't appear to want to be giving up on it either, so he's going to stay engaged, keep talking to both sides, and try to come to a solution in some way that will just simply at least come to a ceasefire, preferably end the war, and lead towards some sort of lasting peace in a very difficult region of the world. And so that's a good thing. I'm not surprised by some of the challenges that we're still seeing with regards to the peace, but I also anticipated that there's a very good chance that Putin would want to keep going, a couple months ago, because as we get closer and closer to winter, that would be more of the target period of time when he'd be willing to potentially slow down or stop the conflict, just because of that sort of inherently happens in the winter anyways here.
Do you think the developments recently made in the Middle East have increased the likelihood of ending the Ukraine war?
Difficult to say. One would hope that the message that a deal can be reached in some form and at least come to a ceasefire, as it has so far in the Gaza Strip. That could be an example for Russia and Ukraine. The dynamics are so different, though, as far as the causes and how they're being waged, that it would be difficult to tie one to the other directly and say, yes, I believe this one will cause peace in the other one. I don't think so personally, but I would love for that to be true. I just think they're so different that they have to be handled in a completely different manner.
So, Colonel, I think one thing that is actually different from when the Alaska meeting happened was the talk of whether President Trump will send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, right? So how does that fit into the picture here in terms of having an end to this war?
My hope with that is that it is purely a threat or a negotiating tactic and not a reality. That's not going to help bring this war to a conclusion if we send Tomahawks to Ukraine, which, by the way, would need U.S. assistance to use them in the first place. And then when you put yourself in the mind of Putin, he's going to look at this as, well, America is more than happy to keep this war going. They're going to provide weapons that reach deep into Moscow. And how would they look at this? There's no other way to argue it, but that we're willing to engage or let Ukraine use our weapons to reach deep into Russia, potentially even Moscow as well. So I understand the negotiating tactic and potential leverage, but I certainly hope we don't actually send these to them.
And as well, Colonel, President Trump was talking about trade between the U.S. and Russia when the Ukraine war is over. How much do you think that is an incentive to end the war?
It could be an incentive to end the war for Russia because their entire economy right now is based on energy supporting the military industrial complex of their own to keep the war going in an attempt to win the war. They don't have much else besides that. Now, they have a lot of it, and they certainly have upwards of what looks like $70 trillion in assets above and below the ground that they could leverage to keep their economy going, but it's just not very well diversified, and they need to have a place to send the energy to make that money in the first place. So now we're talking primarily Europe again, because that's where they send the bulk of it anyways. Trade with Russia in general after a conflict could happen, and it's not historically unprecedented for nations at war to, whether directly or indirectly, to engage in trade after the war comes to a ceasefire and hopefully an actual lasting peace treaty.
Okay, Colonel, would you be able to comment a bit more on the strength of this incentive? Because Russia has China and India as trading partners, right?
They do. And all of these trading partners are tenuous based on relationships. And so part of what we've been trying to do, at least what I hope we've been trying to do, is actually peel Russia away from China, because that is a dangerous relationship to Western nations specifically. If we can do that with the promise of trade in the future, I think that would be worth considering. And frankly, this is something that we're revisiting for a second time, because we initially considered doing this after the fall of the Soviet Union. The wall came down, and we were trying to tie Russia to Western Europe and NATO and the U.S. more specifically, in order to draw them into the fold and help them create something that was better than what they had. To me, this is actually could be try number two, to see if they're willing to do that, rather than align themselves with nations like China, even India, friendships with Iran, Syria, and elsewhere.
Okay, Colonel, we just have a bit of time left, and I also wanted your comments on the Middle East situation. And we did see a post from President Trump warning Hamas earlier about alleged killings taking place in Gaza. Trump, gave a stark warning that should killings continue, we will have to go in and kill them, he says. Do you think he's referring to the United States here? How are you looking at this?
Well, he followed that up by saying, not us. And that to me is very important, because when he says we are going to go in there, I'm always want to know who we means. And ultimately, what I would envision, because I do believe that Hamas will not disarm, they will break this ceasefire, and they will continue what I call tribal violence now, because there's a power vacuum, and they're going to try to become what they were before at some scale. But if there is the necessity to go back into Gaza, Israel is staged best to do it, and it would look kind of like what it was before, where we supported them in some way, maybe with intelligence and defense from other nations. Israel knows the ground. They know both the geography and the people. They can handle it just fine on their own. With a little bit of support from us, it would get even better. I believe that's what that answer is. And then the question becomes, what does it look like after?
Right. Just one last question here. Now that the remaining living hostages are out, would you say perhaps it'd be fairly simple to take over Gaza by force if necessary, if Hamas does not stick to the remaining points of the deal?
I wouldn't call it simple by any means. It's urban warfare still was the hardest kind of conflict ever. That does make it easier in some regards, because you're not having to worry about whether or not you're targeting something with a living Israeli hostage there. So targeting of some things does become a lot simpler, but the overall picture of the conflict remains extremely difficult. But the IDF is more than capable of doing this.
Okay, well, Colonel, really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Don.